Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This video is part 1 of a 2-video series on how to fly an LDA approach. In this video we'll take a look at LDA approaches, what they are and how to fly them. Then we'll demonstrate flying an LDA approach that has a glide slope in the G1000 equipped Cessna 172. In the second video we'll take a look at how to fly an LDA approach with no glide slope. Before you watch this video, it's a good idea to be familiar with the basics of instrument flying, as well as the basics of flying instrument approaches. It's also a good idea to be familiar with the basic operation of the Garmin G1000. While we won't be using the GPS to fly this approach, we'll be using many of the other features of this avionics suite. It's also not a bad idea to be familiar with the basics of how an ILS approach works and how to fly one, as an LDA with a glide slope and an ILS approach are basically flown the same way until you get the runway in sight. I'll leave a link to all these videos, plus a link to the entire instrument flying course in this video's description. So what is an LDA approach? LDA is an abbreviation for Localizer Type Directional Aid. The name is a bit of a misnomer because the nav aid is a localizer and functions exactly the same as a localizer on an ILS or a standalone localizer approach, except for one important difference. It's not aligned directly with the extended runway centerline. On a normal ILS or localizer approach, the course of the localizer must be within 3 degrees of the runway's heading. If the approach course is offset by more than 3 degrees, the approach will be an LDA rather than an ILS or localizer approach. Though if the approach is within 30 degrees of the runway heading, it can still have straight-in approach minimums. The approach course may not be aligned with the runway for several reasons. It may be due to terrain in the area, where an offset approach course will route the aircraft over the lowest terrain and avoid higher terrain. It may be due to surrounding airspace, where an offset approach course will avoid an area of airspace utilized by other traffic. And in the past, LDAs have been used to space out approach courses at busy airports with parallel runways that are too close to run simultaneous parallel ILS approaches. Though most of these approaches have now been decommissioned and replaced with RNAV approaches. The antenna is also typically located at the side of the runway for the LDA serves rather than at the opposite end like a traditional localizer, though like localizer antennas, LDA antennas are not generally depicted in the sim's default scenery. Other than the offset approach course, the nav aid itself is exactly like a localizer. It's labeled as a localizer on the approach chart. So you can see we have the LDA approach to runway 34 into Drake Field in Fayetteville, Arkansas pulled up. And our primary nav aid down here for this LDA approach is labeled as a localizer approach. It operates on the same frequencies as a localizer. That's going to be 108 to 112 megahertz using the odd tenths on those. So for example, 108.1, 108.15, 108.3. This digit will always be an odd digit. That's going to be your localizer frequencies as well as LDA frequencies. It has the same type of ID system. It's going to be a 4-letter ID starting with the letter I. You can see our localizer here on this approach has an identifier of ILFH. It has a range of 18 nautical miles, and just like a normal localizer, how far out you can receive it is dependent on how far off course you are. And it can be more if it is charted as having a receivable distance of more on the chart. It also has a course width of between 3 and 6 degrees, just like a normal localizer. Typically, it's going to be around 5 degrees, which is going to make it about 4 times more sensitive or 4 times more precise than a VOR course indication. Just like a localizer on a normal localizer or ILS approach, it may be equipped with DME or it may not be equipped with DME. Usually it will say in the top left-hand corner of the chart, it will say localizer/DME. And then if the approach says LDA/DME, that means DME is required for the approach. So always check those notes. Sometimes you'll see it in the notes that it says DME is required, or it may be required for something like procedure entry like it is on this approach. So always check those chart notes to see if it is equipped with DME. does it require you to use DME to be able to fly the procedure. Like a regular localizer, an LDA approach may have a glide slope that will give you approved vertical guidance to the runway, or it can be a standalone LDA approach with no glide slope. The approach without a glide slope is flown much like a standalone localizer approach, and we'll talk about how to do that in our next video. And the approaches with a glide slope fly pretty much exactly like an ILS, and that's the approach we'll focus on today. The approaches with a glide slope are less numerous than the ones that don't have one. If an approach has a glide slope, you should see LDA glide slope in big bold capital letters somewhere on the plan view of the approach, but you can also look for the gray shaded area that indicates the presence of a glide slope on the profile view as well. It's also worth noting that even on the approaches that have a glide slope, they're not considered precision approaches. The approaches with a glide slope are considered approaches with vertical guidance, or APVs, just like an LPV type RNAV approach that gives you vertical guidance, which means that the FAA considers them non-precision approaches for things like using that airport as an alternate. And the approaches without a glide slope are considered just plain old non-precision approaches. Because they're offset and not aligned with the runway, the approach minimums are a little higher on LDA approaches than what you would have on an ILS or localizer approach, with the minimums for the approaches with a glide slope typically having a ceiling minimum between 300 and 500 feet, and typically about a mile for the visibility minimums, and the ceiling minimums are typically around 500 to 700 feet for the approaches without a glide slope, though like every instrument approach, that can vary a lot from airport to airport depending on a lot of different local factors such as terrain and approach lighting. LDA approaches are not very common types of approaches, with only 25 available in the United States as of November 2023. If you'd like to see a complete list of them, you can find it on the Wikipedia page for localizer type directional aid, and it also has an incomplete list of LDA approaches in other countries, and a list of some that have been decommissioned, including the infamous LDA approach into Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong. It's also worth noting that these types of approaches are sometimes referred to as instrument guidance systems, or IGS approaches, outside the US. So let's talk about the basic technique for flying an LDA with glide slope approach, and then hop in the air and demonstrate flying one. The technique for flying an LDA with glide slope approach is exactly the same as the technique you use to fly an ILS approach. You want to intercept the localizer course and then use small changes in heading to keep the CDI centered. Then you want to intercept the glide slope and track it using a targeted descent rate, making small changes to your descent rate to keep the glide slope centered. Just like an ILS, your minimums are a decision altitude, or DA, so when you get to the DA, you'll take a look up and either continue to a visual landing if you have the runway, or execute the missed approach if you don't. The only difference between this type of approach and an ILS is that when you break out, the runway won't be directly in front of you, and you'll have to make a shallow turn once you're in visual conditions to align the aircraft with the runway. To demonstrate flying this type of approach, we'll conduct a short IFR flight between Fort Smith Regional Airport in Fort Smith, Arkansas to Fayetteville's Drake Field in Fayetteville, Arkansas in the G1000 equipped Cessna 172. We'll plan to fly the LDA approach to runway 34 at Drake Field, which is an LDA approach with a glide slope. After departing Fort Smith Airport, we'll navigate direct to Fort Smith VOR, which serves as an initial approach fix for the approach. We'll then fly the 006-degree radial off the Fort Smith VOR to intercept the LDA course at Watug intersection and continue in on the approach from there. Our filed route will be Fort Smith Airport, direct Fort Smith VOR, direct Watug intersection, direct Fayetteville Airport, though in real life you could probably just file from Fort Smith Airport to Fort Smith VOR and then direct Drake Field and let them know that you'll be starting the approach, the LDA approach, from the VOR. We'll file for an altitude of 4,000 feet, which is the procedure altitude for the initial approach segment from the Fort Smith VOR. The flight is about 61 track miles long, which should take about a half an hour to fly in the Cessna 172. We'll plan to depart runway 8 from Fort Smith Regional. We've checked the departure information for the airport, and though there's an obstacle departure procedure for every other runway at the airport, there's not one for runway 8. So we can use the standard diverse departure procedure of climbing on runway heading to 400 feet AGL or 869 feet MSL before we turn on course to the VOR. There's also a minimum climb gradient for departing runway 8, but the Cessna 172 can easily achieve that. We'll assume that the weather at Fort Smith is good enough that we can get back in on one of the approaches there and that we feel comfortable departing. Weather at Fayetteville right now is currently reported as calm winds, 1 1/4 mile statute mile visibility in mist, a ceiling of overcast 400, a temperature of 13, dew point of 13, and altimeter 2992, and the forecast is for it to remain about the same the rest of the day. We will assume that we have filed an alternate for the flight and that it is a legal alternate. All right, so let's take a detailed look at the approach plate here to make sure we're aware of everything we need to be aware of while we are preparing to fly this approach. We take a look at the top left-hand corner. It tells us it's in Fayetteville, Arkansas, so we verify that. It is the LDA to runway 34 at Drake Field. The FAA identifier is going to be Foxtrot Yankee Victor, and the ICAO identifier will be Kilo Foxtrot Yankee Victor. It tells us that the primary nav aid for the approach is a localizer with DME. The identifier for that nav aid is going to be India Lima Fox Hotel. Tells us the frequency is 11.9, and then gives us channel information that is TAC-in channel information. We can't do anything with it as civilian users. It's just another way to tell that we have DME on this localizer. It does have the same information down here on the primary nav aid box. We can tell this is the primary nav aid because it is a bolded box. Tells us it is a localizer. It's a 111.9. Gives us the ID both in letters and then in Morse code, and then again gives us the channel information. It tells us that the approach course is 352, and we have that down on the inbound course on the plan view as well. Then it gives us some runway information. The runway landing length is 6,005 feet. The touchdown zone elevation is 1241. The airport elevation is 1252. It does tell us that we need DME for the procedure entry. So to get from the initial approach fix to the intermediate approach fix, we do require DME. And really, it's good to have DME to identify these other fixes with here, these intermediate fixes and step down fixes as we proceed in on the approach. I don't see any other way you could identify these other than using a GPS for most of them. WATUG you can identify with the intersection of the radial from Fort Smith, VOR, and the LDA, but the rest of them I don't see any cross radials or anything like that, so really the DME is the best way to identify those. It does have a T up here which tells us that something is non-standard about departing out of this field under IFR, so we need to look that up if we're going to leave here under IFR, and then it tells us that the A tells us that there are non-standard alternate minimums for filing this airport as an alternate. It tells us that the NOP table does not apply if there's inoperative approach lighting. Luckily, everything is working fine. It tells us that circling is not authorized east of runway 1634, which we are not going to circle, so that's not applicable to us. And then it tells us that something about the runway 34 helicopter visibility, which we're not a helicopter, so we can ignore that as well. It tells us that it has an omnidirectional approach lighting system. This is a set of sequenced flashing lights that you can see from anywhere that you're viewing the lights from. So that's the type of approach lighting system we're looking for when we break out. Then it gives us the missed approach procedure, tells us to climb straight ahead to 2,200 feet, then make a climbing left turn while climbing to 4,000 on a heading of 260, and then intercept the Razorback Vortac 221 degree radial and track that out to Sumo, which is a 22.1 DME and hold, and that's depicted here straight out to 2,200 feet. Then hang a left turn to a heading of 260, intercept this radial, and take it out to Sumo. So all that is on there. It also has that depicted down here on the profile view, straight out to 2,000, then left turn 260, 4,000, intercept that radial, go to Sumo intersection. It has all of the frequencies that we'll need as far as our comm frequencies in the order that we're going to use them. Pick up the weather first, and then we would be talking to Razorback Approach. then Drake Tower, and then ground control, and then it does have a Unicom for services like fuel that would work in real life but won't be emulated in Flight Simulator. Looking at the plan view, we do have just a little bit of water up here that's depicted on the chart. We do have a note to tell us that this is an LDA with a glide slope. We have the MSA down here, minimum safe altitude or minimum sector altitude. This is within 25 nautical miles of Razorback VOR, and it does have 3 different sectors: 3,200 feet if we're north of the VOR, 3,600 feet if we're south west of the VOR, and 4,500 feet if we're southeast of the VOR. None of that really matters too much to us because we'll be on this initial approach segment here, which has its own procedure altitude. It does have a feeder route that comes in from Razorback VOR. We won't have to worry about that. And then the only other way to get into the approach is we could use the initial intermediate fix here of Watog and navigate direct to that using a GPS if we wanted to. But we're going to use this initial approach fix from Fort Smith VOR, and then this initial approach segment from Fort Smith VOR. It tells us that the procedure altitude for this segment right here is going to be 4,000 feet. It is 26.9 miles from Fort Smith VOR to Watog intersection, and it's the 006 degree radial. So we've got all the information on that. It does have some notes here about if we're coming from the 358 radial clockwise around to the 036 degree radial, we can't use this intermediate segment, but that would be coming from this direction. Let's see here, 358 around, coming in from the north. We are coming in from this direction over here, having departed Fort Smith Airport. It has multiple obstacles on here, and then the tallest obstacle is down here, 3415. It's the one that's printed in the largest symbol and with the largest font, so that is the largest obstacle, and that's the reason that our MSA is so high in this sector over here. That's well to the east of our course and won't be a factor for us. We have several fixes that are identified with these solid lines going across the course here. These are fixes we use to identify step-down fixes until we get to the glide slope intercept, and then there's one that is a step-down fix if we were to fly the LDA without the glide slope that we don't have to use, that we don't need to worry about while we're flying the approach with the glide slope. Each of them is identified with the cross line going across the localizer, then it's given the name, gives the squiggly line to point from the name to where that fix is located, and then it gives the, tells you ILFH tells you that the DME to identify this fix is from the localizer, not from like Razorback VOR or something like that, and then it gives you the DME distance that will identify that fix. So for example, Wulil here is identified with being on the localizer at 5.7 miles DME from the localizer antenna. That's how you know that you're at this particular fix. It also gives those fixes on the plan view, and it's a little easier to see those on the plan view, and we'll talk about more what we're going to do with those in the plan view here in just a little bit. Most of those are step-down fixes. There's some that we need to adhere to prior to intercepting the glide slope, and then there's one OLEXI, which we only have to adhere to if we are not using the glide slope to fly the approach. When we're flying it with the glide slope, we don't have to worry about this crossing restriction here. But again, we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. It also gives us a note here that the final approach course is offset 5.5 degrees. So that's how much the approach course is tilted compared to what would be a straight in approach. So it's altered 5 degrees, 5.5 degrees to the left. That's where the course is oriented relative to the runway center line. And you can kind of see this down in the airport view, the runway diagram down here. It shows the arrow coming in a little bit skewed off to the left. That's where the approach comes in from. So looking at the plan view, it does have a note up here to use the localizer DME when you're on the localizer course to identify those fixes. It shows you the procedure turn down here and tells you that the procedure turn or the procedure altitude when you're in the procedure turn is 4,000 feet. So once you're established in that procedure turn, if you're going to use it, which we are not, then that altitude prior to Watug is going to be 4,000 feet. Once you hit Watug, which is identified with 10.1 DME from the localizer, you can descend down to 3,100 feet until you hit Woolil, and that's identified with 5.7 DME. And then once you hit Woolil, you can descend down to 2,900 feet, and that's where you will intercept the glide slope, which is what this squiggly arrow depicts here. And it looks like you'll intercept the glide slope right at Trium. You'll pass Trium at 2,900 feet, intercept the glide slope at 2,900 feet, and then ride that on down. We're actually going to do this a little bit differently than what's depicted here. It is legal to intercept the glide slope from a higher altitude, so we're going to intercept it from 4,000, and then you just have to monitor the crossing fix at Woolil here and make sure that if you ride the glide slope down, that you adhere to this procedure altitude at Woolil and cross Woolil at or above 3,100 feet, and it will do that. And then we'll go ahead and ride the glide slope on in. We'll talk more about that technique here in just a second. Tells us that the glide slope is 3.5 degrees, so it is going to be a little steeper than your standard 3-degree glide slope. We're going to need a little higher rate of descent than we would need on just a normal ILS, and it tells us if we stay on that glide slope across the threshold, our threshold crossing height is 57 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. It gives us the mileage down here between each fix, and the mileage from the last fix to the runway threshold. And then we do have, as I mentioned earlier, this fix of Olexi here, which is only a crossing restriction or a step-down fix that you have to meet if you're flying the LDA without glide slope. We do not have to worry about it when we are flying the LDA on the glide slope. So looking at the minimums, the line we want to look at is this top line that is S-LDA slant GS34. That is the straight in LDA with glide slope for runway 34, which is the approach we're going to be shooting. So that's the minimum line we want to use. It tells us that the decision altitude for this approach is 1,593. So when we get it to 1,593 on our altimeter, we need to take a look up and see if we see runway lights and can continue the approach to a visual landing, or if we need to execute the missed approach. It tells us that the minimum visibility required to shoot this approach and to land from this approach is 1¼ mile. And then it tells us that the height above touchdown zone of this decision altitude is 352 feet. So when we get to our decision altitude on our altimeter, we're going to be about 352 feet above the ground or above the touchdown zone elevation. And again, the parentheses, numbers in the parentheses are for military, and they do not apply to us. We are Category A aircraft, and you can see the minimums are the same for A, B, and C category aircraft, and then Category D aircraft are not authorized to use this approach. The next line down is the straight-in LDA without the glide slope. Well, that's not the approach we're going to shoot, but if you wanted to shoot that approach, that's the minimums for that approach. And then our the last line is for circling to land from this approach, which we're not going to do. Taking a look at the airport diagram, at the top left, it tells us the airport elevation again, the touchdown zone elevation over here. Tells us that we have a medium intensity runway lighting system on runway 16 and 34. It tells us that we have the control tower over here. It's 1,339 feet tall. It tells us that we have an omnidirectional approach lighting system down here. So that's the approach lighting system we're looking for when we break out. It does show that we have a PAPI over here on runway 34 as well as runway 16. Unfortunately, this is not depicted in Flight Simulator, so this is missing, but there is not any sort of adjustment that we need to make to our visibility or anything like that for an out-of-service PAPI. We just need to be aware that it's not working. It shows the arrow coming in from the direction that the approach is going to come in from. If you are on course, this is where your aircraft should wind up, and you can see it's just a little bit left of the runway center line, so once we break out, we'll need to maneuver over to the right to align ourselves with the center line and make that visual landing. Also tells you the course and the distance from the final approach fix. All right, now let's talk about the technique we're going to use for flying this approach. So when we take off from Fort Smith Airport, we will proceed direct to Fort Smith VOR. We'll climb up to 4,000 feet. There's not much distance between the Fort Smith Airport and the Fort Smith VOR. It'll be enough to get to our cruise altitude, but we'll probably be leveling about at 4,000 feet by the time we get to the VOR, which is why we don't need to go any higher than 4,000 feet, because once we get to 4,000 feet, will be already getting established on a segment that has a procedure altitude that we know is safe. So we'll get to the VOR and we will go ahead and turn and track the 006 degree radial, and we're going to track that 26.9 nautical miles or 26.9 DME, and that's where we will intercept the localizer and start tracking that inbound for the approach. We'll assume that we get clearance when we get about 10 miles from Watug. So they will call us up and say you're cleared for the approach, which authorizes us to use this procedure altitude. It tells us if we're flying this initial approach segment, we don't need to fly a procedure turn, so we don't need to do this holding pattern at Watug. And again, it gives us the radial and distance. About 10 miles from Watug, again, is where we'll get our clearance. That will be about 20.1 DME on the localizer and about 16.9 DME away from Fort Smith VOR. That's where we'll assume our clearance, and that will give us clearance to go ahead and descend down on the rest of the approach. And I'll mention that I'm going to track the radial from Fort Smith out to about 16.9 DME, which is about 10 miles from Watug. And then what I'm going to do, I'm trying to track that probably in with VOR number 1 up in our CDI. And then when I get to that point, I'm going to probably flip into heading mode and then flip this Fort Smith VOR over to radio 2 and track that with our bearing pointer, and then put the localizer up in nav radio number 1 and have that available so we can see when we are intercepting the localizer. Then we'll go ahead. I'm going to fly this approach on the autopilot, so I'll probably go ahead and arm the approach at that point. And then we can go ahead and track the localizer and the glide slope. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to fly the vertical portion of this a little bit differently. We will be able to receive the glide slope when we're out here by Watug or a little bit prior to that. So what we're going to do is we're going to stay at 4,000 feet. We'll arm the approach mode in the autopilot. Again, you can hand fly this if you want to, or fly it with the flight director. We're going to fly it with the autopilot today. And so we will arm that approach mode, and we will allow it to track the glide slope down. That is legal to do that. You can track the glide slope if you're receiving it beyond the charted distance and beyond the charted fixes. If you'd like to do that, the only caveat is that you need to monitor any crossing fixes and make sure that you cross those at the appropriate altitude. So we do have, Watug at 4,000 feet. We will not be descending on the glide slope. We won't intercept the glide slope until we're slightly beyond Watug. And then we need to make sure that we cross this next intersection, Wooleel, at 31 at or above 3,100 feet. So just monitor your altimeter. When you get to 5.7 nautical miles, make sure you're either at or above 3,100 feet. And if it appears that you won't be, then you do need to intervene, with vertical speed or something like that. But the approach is designed so that you will cross Wooleel at or above 3,100 feet. And then we can just track the glide slope the rest of the way down to decision altitude. So the way that we're going to do this is, again, intercept the glide slope will be slightly after Watug. We'll reduce our power once we intercept the glide slope to maintain our cruise airspeed of about 110 knots indicated airspeed. And then we'll monitor our altitude at our crossing fixes. And then when we get to about 3 miles from Trium, which is about 7.1 DME, which is just slightly inside of Wutag and a little bit outside of Wooleel, we're going to go ahead and configure the approach. And the way we're configure for the approach, the way we're going to do that is reduce our power to 1,500 RPM. This is a little bit lower RPM than we usually use because we are in a descent already. So we'll need to pull the power back a little further. At 110 knots of indicated airspeed, we will extend the flaps to 10. We should already be at 110 or below. If not, we'll pull off a little more power. At 85 knots of indicated airspeed, then we'll go ahead and extend the flaps incrementally to 30 degrees, so 1 notch at a time down to 30 degrees. and then at 70 knots or maybe just a little bit before, increase that power to maintain that 70 knots as you track the glide slope down. Usually around 1800 to 2000 RPMs is what you're going to need to track that glide slope. Once we're stabilized on the glide slope, we'll go ahead and accomplish the before landing checklist. At this point, we'll probably get handed off to the tower. We'll track the localizer and the glide slope to the decision altitude, just like we did with an ILS. And then we will transition to and maneuver for a visual landing once the required visual cues are in sight. So once those approach lights are in sight, we'll make that turn and align with the runway, or we'll execute the missed approach if we get down to decision altitude and we don't have anything in sight, or whenever it's appropriate prior to that. When you break out on the approach, you're going to find yourself a little bit left of the runway center line if you've flown the approach centered up to minimums. So make a gentle right turn to align the aircraft with the runway's extended center line. I like to think of it as making a turn to intercept that extended center line and then aligning with the runway from there. Make sure to keep your descent rate constant as you make that maneuver so that you don't end up high. There is a tendency for most pilots to pull up as they look up, so do be cognizant of that. Again, there's no visual glide slope on this runway in Flight Simulator, even though there is a PAPI on it in real life. But in both the sim and in real life, you can still use that electronic glide slope to gauge and adjust your descent to the runway. All right, so let's talk about how to set up this flight from the world map. We'll start at the top left like we usually do. So for aircraft, we do want the Textron Aviation Cessna 172 Skyhawk G1000. Arista Blue is a third-party livery that I have added in there. You won't see that unless you have that third-party livery in there. Liveries, you can do as you would like. Weight and balance, we do want to set up with 2 full tanks, 28 gallons in each tank, and 2 170-pound occupants in the front seat. And then failures, you don't need anything there, and customization, you can do what you want with that. For the departure, we'll go ahead and put in Kilo Foxtrot Sierra Mike, which is Fort Smith Regional. I'll click on that. And it is runway 8 in real life, but it is runway 7 in the sim. That appears to be behind. I think that is a change that happened a few years ago. And you can either start on runway 7 in the sim, or you can start over, this is the general aviation ramp over here. You can start over there as well. Just a note that if you do start on the runway, you can see the point is not exactly lined up correctly with the runway there, so you will have to taxi onto the runway. It won't actually start you on the center like it should. And then as far as the ramp, we'll start on the ramp, and so we'll go ahead and select a parking space over there. And I'm going to set up from the ramp, but again, you can set up where you'd like. We're going to set noon for the time, or excuse me, we need to set the date first before we set the time down there. So we'll select a mid-June day, and then we will set the time down here in the bottom to noon for lighting conditions. That'll give us good lighting conditions. And we will set the weather in the sim itself. So that sets us up for everything we need for the flight from here, and we can go ahead and click on fly. As far as setting up the weather for the flight, we'll start on the right-hand side here, and we'll do that from in session. We will set altitude calculation to AMSL. That means that the clouds won't rise with the terrain, so you have a consistent cloud base. Precipitation we will set to 0, so we have no additional restrictions to visibility, snow depth, and lightning we don't need. Temperature we'll set at standard of 59. We'll set it at 60, and that will give us enough clearance so that we do not get into icing conditions at 4,000 feet. We'll set the pressure to a standard of 2992 to keep it simple, and then the humidity at 1, which is the lowest value, so that we don't get any additional restrictions to visibility from that. And then the cloud layer, we'll just set the lowest cloud layer. We'll set the coverage to overcast 100%, density to 0.5. That will give us about 1.25 miles visibility when we break out, so we'll have good visibility to transition to a visual. Scatter, it really doesn't matter what you do with this if it's at overcast 100% on the coverage, but we do have it set to 0. I've got the top set at about 12,000 feet, so we will not break out, and then the bottoms are set to 600 feet. MSL, and that is 1,000 feet roughly underneath our minimums. That should give us a good ceiling where we'll bake out right above or right below minimums. I did save this as KFYV LDA 34, so I can pull it up again quickly. So you can do that using the Save As key over here, and that sets up our weather. So let's get inside the aircraft and start to set that up. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how to set the avionics up for the flight. I'll start with the nav radios. For nav radio number 1, I'm going to put Fort Smith VOR, which is 10.4 in the primary, so we can navigate out to Fort Smith VOR and then track that VOR radial up to the intercept for the approach. I'm going to go ahead and set 11.9, which is our localizer frequency, standing by in number 1. Then I'm going to push the middle of this knob to get this transferred to nav 2. For nav 2, I'm going to put Fort Smith VOR in the active here, so that I can utilize that, the bearing pointer for that, as I transition over to monitoring the LDA for intercept. And then I'm going to put Razorback VOR, which is 116.4, as the standby thing in here, and that's for setting up for the missed approach. The other things that I want to do is I want to go ahead and set up my autopilot. So I'm going to set the altitude pre-select here to 4,000 feet. So that is set up for my cruise altitude. Let's see here. I'm going to go ahead. I think I am receiving Fort Smith VOR, so I can go ahead and set that to a direct course there. So we've got Fort Smith VOR pulled up there, and we can see where we're going as far as getting direct to the VOR. Let's see here. We also want to set up the runway heading for runway 8, which is going to be 079. At least that's what it was in real life, or what it is in real life. And I think it's pretty close on the sim. I think they did take a while to change over the runway number there, so that's why the runway number is so off from the heading. Let's see, other things that we want to do here. We want to go ahead and set up our PFD options here on the soft key in the bottom left here. So I'll hit that. What I'm going to do, I like to have the wind field up, even though I know there's no wind out there. I put it on option 3. Gives me the quickest data there. And then I will go ahead and activate the DME. It is on nav 1, which is the primary radio there. So that is what I want in there. I am going to go bring up bearing 1, and I'm going to set it to nav 1, and then I'm going to bring up bearing 2 and set it to nav 2 by pressing the bearing 2 key twice, and then that will bring up the bearing pointer for both nav 1 and nav 2, and that'll allow me to navigate on that bearing pointer once I get within 10 miles of Watauga intersection. I can go ahead and switch over to the LDA on 1 to monitor that, and then I can navigate using the bearing pointer while I'm continuing to track that Fort Smith 006 degree radial up to that LDA localizer course intercept. The other things that we want to do is I'm going to go to the timer reference here, and I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to enter my approach speed as my glide speed, so I have a reference for the approach speed. I'm going to turn that off for right now because I don't need that. I will turn that on later. Everything else we can leave on for the takeoff. I'm going to go ahead and turn the minimums on to baro and set up the baro minimums, which is going to be 1593. Make sure that I am looking at that correctly. 1593. So I'll go ahead and scroll up to that. It's going to take a little while here. We can only do 10s, so we'll have to set it up to basically 1,600 feet. You never want to set a bug that's lower than your actual minimums on the plate. So if you have a bug that won't round up, or that won't set an exact number, then you need to round up to the next 10 or 100 or whatever it will round up to. Again, you don't want to set your bug to something that's below what your minimums actually are. So whoops, I went a little bit past that. So down to 1,600 feet. And there is 1,600 feet. So we got 1,600 feet set on there. It won't do 1593. It'll just do 1,600 or 1590. So we'll set it to 1,600 so we don't set something that's below. All right, so that sets up everything on this side. I am not going to load the approach in the GPS. We can fly this all raw data. We don't need the GPS. and I am going to use the small key on the right side on the moving map display, or the multifunction display here, and I'm going to turn that down to the traffic map. It just feels like cheating to me to use a moving map on a raw data approach, so I'm going to go ahead and turn that off so that I'm just using the raw data. That's everything set up with the avionics, so we'll go ahead and call and get our clearance. So Fort Smith Regional has their clearance combined with ground control, so we dial that in and we call them up and we tell them we have the most recent ATIS and would like clearance to Fayetteville Drake Field. They call back and say Cessna 172 Golf Hotel cleared to Fayetteville Drake Field as filed. Climb maintain 4000, departure frequency 120.9, squawk 5502. So we read all that back and we get our squawk code in our transponder, and then we will taxi out, do our run up, and then call tower once we are short of the runway. So we taxi out, we do a run up, we complete our before takeoff checklist, and then we call tower up short of the runway and tell them that we're ready to go. They call back and they say Cessna 172 Golf Hotel. Fly runway heading, runway 7, cleared for takeoff. And so we pull onto the runway and we'll do a normal takeoff from runway 7 or runway 8, whichever one you want to call it. It is designated 7 in Flight Simulator. We will climb straight ahead to at least 400 feet. They will probably hand us off to departure, probably about 800 to 1,000 feet above the field, and then start to give us vectors. We'll get it stabilized on the autopilot, and then we'll start navigating towards Fort Smith VOR once we get that clearance. So once we're airborne, we're handed off to Razorback departure. They call back and they say Cessna 172 Golf Hotel radar contact. Climb maintain 4000, proceed direct to Fort Smith VOR. So I have the bearing pointed straight to Fort Smith VOR. I'm going to go ahead and roll it over there in heading mode and put the heading bug on the top of the bearing pointer there. I'm going to go and center my needle here with the course selector there. And then I'll go ahead and engage it in nav mode. So we'll go ahead and navigate direct to Fort Smith VOR. We've got about 4 nautical miles to go. And then we'll take up that 006 degree radial once we cross over Fort Smith VOR. Climb into 4000. That's our procedure altitude for that initial segment of the approach. And we'll climb up to 4000, cruise out, and start preparing for the approach. As I'm approaching my cruise altitude of 4,000 feet, I'm also approaching the VOR. Remember that the DME is going to have a slant range error, and we're about a mile above the ground, just a little bit less. So about 1 DME, I'm going to expect that flip. What I'm going to do is I'm going to swing the heading over here since I am in VOR tracking mode right now. I'm going to swing the heading over to that radial that I want, which is 006. That way when I get the flip, I can just put it into heading mode and then have time to adjust that the course indicator so that I can get that into tracking mode. Now we're close to the radial here. So there's 0.7 miles. I've still got a 2 indication. Got a lot going on here. I got to watch my speed. I've got to get my power set up, and I'm watching for that VOR flip. There is the flip on the VOR. So as soon as I get the from flag, I am going to go ahead and go into heading mode and get over to that 006 heading. I'm going to go ahead and dial the CDI over to 006, and then I'll manipulate that as needed to get on course. Going to go ahead and pull my power back to the cruise RPM of about 2450. So again, a lot going on here. Looks like I'm going to need maybe 10 degrees to the left to try to get on that radial. I've got the airplane at cruise power. I'll do the cruise check here in just a little bit. And you can see the needle is falling on the bearing pointer here. So it looks like the course is coming in. I'll go ahead and arm the VOR and let the autopilot start doing the course tracking. So I am now established on that 006 degree radial. Actually, I got it wrong. Dialed it in a little bit wrong there. So 006 degree radial in VOR tracking mode. I'm established on that initial approach segment of the approach. And so now we just have 26 nautical miles to fly to intercept that localizer. So we'll stay in this VOR tracking mode with VOR1 up here and having that Fort Smith VOR in there. And then when we get probably about 10 miles out, about 16.9 DME from Fort Smith VOR, we'll go ahead and flip so that we're using the bearing pointer to reference Fort Smith VOR as we continue to track that radial. But but we'll put the LDA into nav 1 so we can watch for that intercept and let the autopilot track that LDA intercept. So we'll cruise out, we'll do our cruise checklist, we'll continue on down the road and prepare for the approach. As we get about 16.9 DME away from Fort Smith VOR, we're handed off to the Fayetteville sector of Razorback approach. We call and check in with them. They call back and they say, Cessna 172 Golf Hotel. You're 10 miles from Watauga. Maintain 4,000 until established on the approach. Cleared for the LDA, runway 34 at Fayetteville Drake Field. We acknowledge that and read that back, and now we are cleared for the approach. We can do all the altitudes, all the procedure altitudes on the approach now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and put the autopilot into heading mode so that it doesn't deviate off its current track. I'm going to go ahead and flip out number 1 nav so that the LDA is now in the number 1 nav, and you can see it automatically sets the course for us. We are cleared for the approach, and we are receiving the nav aid. We're getting a let's see, we're not getting a good digital ID on it yet. We are not getting DME off of it yet, so I will hold off on. Actually, we are getting a good DME, so we are receiving it. So I will go ahead and arm the approach mode there. You can see localizer is armed, Glideslope is also armed, and we can see we're showing a Glideslope here as well. So we'll go ahead and arm the approach mode and let the autopilot intercept and track the localizer. And so we're just going to let the autopilot, again, intercept and track the localizer. It will also intercept and track the Glideslope. And then when we get to about 7.1 DME on this, we'll go ahead and configure the approach as we're riding down on the Glideslope. We've got our minimum set here. So everything is all set up for the approach. We just have to wait for the Glideslope and the localizer to come in. Other things I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and flip this number 2 nav to Razorback VOR. Actually, no, you know what? I'm not going to do that yet because I do want to monitor that bearing pointer until I intercept the LDA localizer here. So I'll leave that up until that's intercepted. Then I'll flip it over to Razorback VOR. And the localizer is starting to come alive there. You can see the localizer tracking mode has activated there. And so we are now intercepting the localizer. Once we get to 10.1 DME, I can go ahead and flip number 2 nav to Razorback. I don't need to track Fort Smith VOR anymore. And then we're just waiting for the Glideslope to come on down. So there's 10.1 nautical miles. That is Watauga intersection. And on the chart, it says that I could go down to 3,100 feet, but it's okay for me to stay up here and intercept the Glideslope as long as I meet those crossing restrictions that are down the way there. Don't need Fort Smith VOR anymore, so I'm going to flip that over to Razorback VOR for the missed approach. We can see Razorback is dialed in there. It doesn't look like I get a digital ID, so technically we should probably listen in to the Morse code for this to make sure that we have the right station, though if you don't want to do that in Flight Sim, I won't deduct any points for that, but in real life you would want to make sure that the station is operative and that it is not out of service and that you're listening to the right station and that the field has the right station tuned up for you. Glideslope is coming alive, so again, initially we're just going to reduce our power and keep it at our cruise speed, and then we get to about 7.1 nautical miles, then we'll go ahead and start configuring for the approach. Alright, so we can see the Glideslope is engaging. We can watch our vertical speed. It starts to come down, so I'll adjust the power so I don't exceed 110 knots. But there is 7.1 nautical miles, or about 3 miles from our final approach fix, so let's go ahead and start to configure for the approach. I'll bring the power back to 1500 RPMs. I'm below 110, so we'll bring that first notch of flaps out. Bring it back here so we can see the flaps. Now I'm waiting on 85 knots to bring the rest of the flaps out. I did go in and mark my approach speed with my glide speed, so that Y is my approach speed reference. There's 85, so I'll bring the next notch of flaps out. One more notch. Then I'll bring my power back in to roughly 1800 to 2000 RPM should be what I need to keep me stabilized on the Glideslope. Go ahead and complete our before landing checklist. and it's likely that we will be handed off to tower at this time. And now I am just, making small corrections on my heading to keep the LDA in the center here, and making a small adjustment on my descent rate if the autopilot wasn't doing it, to stay on the glide slope. Flies exactly like an ILS until we break out. You can notice we do have a little bit steeper rate of descent because we do have a steeper glide slope than normal. There's a 3.5 degree glide slope rather than a 3-degree glide slope. So our descent rate is a little bit higher than we would normally need on a 3-degree glide slope. And I passed, let's see here, Woolil was 5.7 miles. I needed to cross that at or above 3,100. We did that. We do have to monitor that. We don't have to worry about Trium or Alexei intersections. Once we're past Trium, we're officially on the charted glide slope, and we don't have to worry about those crossing restrictions anymore. So we'll just fly this down to our decision altitude, and then we'll take a look up and see if we can acquire visual and maneuver to land, or we will execute the missed approach. It's likely that tower or approach would probably hand us off to tower at this time, so we'll assume that that happened. And we call up tower, tell them when they're on the LDA to runway 34, they call up and they tell us Cessna 172 Golf Hotel, runway 34, cleared to land, winds are calm. We're inside 1,000 feet to our minimums. Again, just making small changes in pitch, power, and heading as necessary to stay on the localizer and the glide slope, just like we would on an ILS. Getting a little slow, pulled off a little too much power. I'll bring that back up to about 1,800 RPMs. And it looks like just a little bit lower than 1,800 is keeping us on speed. And that's probably because of that steeper than normal glide slope. We'll need a little less power than we normally need on a 3-degree ILS. I do have my altitude pre-select set here for 4,000, which is my missed approach altitude, so we're all set up for that. And we're just going to track the glide slope and the localizer down to 1593, and then we'll see if we see anything or if we need to go around.
500.
That's 500 feet to the ground. And there is about 100 feet above our minimums. I'll go ahead and take a look out. There is our runway. So I'll go ahead and kick off the autopilot. I'll make a very gentle turn to go ahead and intercept the center line of the runway. I want to keep that descent rate going so that I don't get high on the approach. Unfortunately, there's no PAPI, but I can continue to use that electronic glide slope. And then we'll just continue to a normal landing. See, it's a very gentle maneuver on this one. We're only offset 5 degrees. So I make a very gentle turn to align with the runway. And then now we're established on a good visual approach. And we'll just continue to a landing from here. So that is how you fly an LDA with a glide slope. Exactly like an ILS, except when you break out, the runway is going to be off to the side somewhere. So when can you consider yourself proficient at these approaches? I would base it on the precision approach airman certification standards criteria. So this is the ACS standards for the instrument rating for an instrument airplane rating. It's area of operation 6, which is instrument approaches, and task B, precision approaches, is more applicable probably than non-precision approaches. So prior to the final approach fix, you need to be able to maintain your altitude plus or minus 100 feet, maintain your heading plus or minus 10 degrees, maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and then accurately track radials, courses, and bearings, meaning not going full scale deflection. And then from the final approach fix to the decision altitude, the standards are that you're able to maintain a stabilized approach. They don't want to see an excessive rate of descent to, catch the glide slope. You need to be able to allow no more than 3/4 scale deflection of the lateral or vertical course guidance, in this case, the localizer or the glide slope. Maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and then immediately initiate the missed approach procedure at your decision altitude if you don't have a visual, or transition to a visual approach using a normal rate of descent and normal maneuvering, which is, again, a little bit different. About the only thing that's different between this and a normal ILS approach is that transition to the visual and the maneuver to the landing. So that concludes this video. Hopefully it's given you the knowledge and skills you need to fly LDA approaches with a glide slope on your own. Make sure to tune in to video 2 in this series, where we'll fly a demonstration of an LDA approach without a glide slope. As always, if you've enjoyed the content, don't forget to like the video, share with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.